There is one question that keeps coming back whenever people talk about the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. It is not simply who may have been responsible, or where the investigation could lead next. It is something that sounds much simpler, yet may be just as important. Why has the explanation of the motive appeared to shift over time? For many people following the case, the public messages have not always seemed to fit together. One official statement points in one direction. A later update appears to place emphasis somewhere else. Reporters ask the same questions in different ways, and the answers sometimes leave room for more interpretation than certainty. That has led some observers to wonder whether investigators have always agreed on the central theory, or whether the evidence itself has continued to change as more information has come in. At first, that seemed straightforward. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of bringing complete clarity, each new development encouraged another round of discussion. Every update appeared to answer one question while creating another. That brings us to the heart of today's story. Not because there is proof of disagreement inside the FBI. There is no verified evidence showing investigators were openly divided. But because the public messaging surrounding the possible motive has led many people to ask whether different possibilities have been weighed at different stages of the investigation. Understanding why that happens may tell us almost as much as any single piece of evidence. To understand why this issue matters, we have to go back to the beginning. When Nancy Guthrie disappeared, the first hours were exactly what investigators hope will produce answers. Officers moved quickly. Family members spoke with law enforcement. Friends were contacted. Witnesses were identified. Every available detail was examined. As happens in nearly every major missing person investigation, authorities started collecting information before reaching conclusions. That process can be messy. Early reports often include statements that later prove incomplete or inaccurate. Witnesses remember events differently. New evidence changes priorities. Investigators adjust their theories as facts develop. That is not unusual. In fact, experienced investigators often remind the public that an early theory should never be mistaken for a final conclusion. Still, for people watching from the outside, changes can feel confusing. The public rarely sees every interview, every forensic report, or every tip that arrives. Instead, they hear occasional updates delivered weeks or months apart. Those updates may emphasize different details depending on what investigators believe is appropriate to release. According to former investigators who have spoken publicly about other high-profile cases, law enforcement sometimes withholds information intentionally. They may want to protect witnesses. They may hope to verify a confession. They may avoid alerting a potential suspect about evidence that has not yet become public. That approach can create an appearance of inconsistency even when investigators remain focused on the same overall direction. But in Nancy Guthrie's case, many followers believe the messaging itself deserves closer attention. One update appeared to focus heavily on one possible explanation. Later discussions seemed to shift attention elsewhere. Reporters covering the investigation asked whether the motive had become clearer. The responses often stressed that investigators continued following every credible lead. Those answers were accurate as far as they went. Yet they also left many people wondering exactly how the pieces fit together. Was one theory becoming stronger? Had another become weaker? Or were investigators simply refusing to narrow their focus too soon? Those are very different possibilities. Anyone who has watched complex criminal investigations unfold over the years knows this pattern. Think back to other nationally known cases. Initial assumptions were sometimes replaced by stronger evidence months later. Investigators publicly corrected earlier impressions. What looked obvious during the first week no longer appeared convincing after laboratory testing, surveillance reviews, financial records, or additional interviews. That process can appear slow. Sometimes frustratingly slow. But it reflects the reality of criminal investigations. Evidence does not always arrive in the order people expect. One witness comes forward months later. A digital record is recovered. A previously overlooked conversation suddenly becomes significant. A vehicle is identified after thousands of hours reviewing video footage. Every new discovery has the potential to reshape the picture. That would have been the end of it. But another detail stood out. As journalists continued asking questions about Nancy Guthrie's case, attention increasingly turned toward the issue of motive itself. Not because motive alone proves guilt. It does not. A criminal case depends upon evidence connecting a person to a crime. Motive can explain why someone might act, but it cannot establish that they actually did. Still, motive often helps investigators organize their work. Imagine trying to complete a 1,000-piece puzzle without first knowing what picture belongs on the box. Every piece matters, but finding the larger image makes each individual piece easier to place. Investigators frequently approach motive the same way. They ask whether financial concerns existed. Whether personal relationships had become strained. Whether someone stood to benefit. Whether there were ongoing disputes. Whether outside pressures might explain unusual behavior. Each possibility leads to different interviews, different records, and different investigative strategies. According to investigators in numerous public cases over the years, it is common to pursue several possible motives simultaneously. Only later does one appear stronger than the others. That reality may explain some of the public confusion. When officials describe an investigation as active, they often mean exactly that. Active. Not finished. Not settled. Not reduced to a single explanation. That distinction is easy to overlook, especially as media coverage continues. Television viewers naturally want clear answers. News organizations often summarize complicated investigations into brief reports lasting only 2 or 3 minutes. Important context disappears simply because there is not enough time. Viewers may hear one sentence highlighting financial issues. The following week another report discusses family relationships. Later, investigators mention digital evidence. Each report sounds different. But together they may represent one continuous investigation rather than competing conclusions. That is something experienced crime reporters frequently remind their audiences. Still, Nancy Guthrie's case has generated unusual attention. People continue examining every public appearance, every interview, every newly released document, searching for clues that might explain why investigators emphasize certain details while saying very little about others. Some believe silence itself is meaningful. Others argue silence should not be interpreted at all. Both perspectives exist because so much remains unknown. Records show investigators have continued encouraging anyone with relevant information to come forward. Public appeals have remained focused on obtaining verifiable evidence rather than speculation. That approach reflects standard investigative practice in complex cases. Meanwhile, reporters have continued pressing officials for clearer explanations. Sometimes the answers sound cautious. Sometimes they sound deliberately narrow. Sometimes officials simply repeat that the investigation remains ongoing. For viewers hoping for certainty, those responses can feel unsatisfying. But there may be practical reasons behind them. If investigators publicly reject one possible motive too early, they risk discouraging witnesses who possess information pointing in that direction. If they openly endorse another theory before sufficient evidence exists, they risk creating expectations that later cannot be supported. Neither outcome helps an investigation. Instead, authorities often speak in measured language. They choose words carefully. They avoid promising conclusions before evidence allows them to do so. To many listeners, however, measured language can sound like mixed messaging. That difference in perception has become one of the most discussed aspects of the Nancy Guthrie investigation. And it raises another question that deserves attention. If the public hears different emphases over time, are investigators changing their thinking because the evidence has evolved? Or has the overall investigative strategy remained consistent while only the public presentation has shifted? Those two possibilities may sound similar. They are not. One suggests changing conclusions. The other suggests changing communication. Without access to the complete investigative file, it is impossible to know which explanation is correct. What is clear is that investigators continue treating the case as active, and many important details remain undisclosed. That brings us to another development that has kept this conversation alive. As more observers compared earlier public statements with more recent comments, they noticed subtle differences in what officials chose to emphasize. Some thought those differences revealed an evolving investigation. Others believed they reflected nothing more than the normal progression of a complex case. The distinction matters. Because before anyone can understand what investigators may have been trying to communicate, it helps to examine exactly how those public statements changed over time, and whether those changes point toward new evidence or simply a different way of discussing the same investigation. The closer people looked at the public statements, the more they realized that the differences were often subtle rather than dramatic. No official announcement declared that investigators had abandoned one theory and adopted another. There was no press conference in which someone stood before cameras and said the investigation had taken a completely different direction. Instead, the changes were quieter. One update highlighted one aspect of the case. A later interview emphasized another. A reporter asked about relationships. The answer focused on evidence. Someone else asked about possible financial motives. Officials responded that they were examining all available information. None of those responses necessarily contradicted one another. Yet taken over several months, they created the impression that the conversation itself was moving. For people who have followed criminal investigations for years, this kind of shift is familiar. An investigation is not a straight road. It is a process of eliminating possibilities, confirming facts, and testing assumptions. Investigators begin with hundreds of questions. Slowly, some questions receive answers. Others remain open. And every answer has the potential to change which question becomes most important next. Imagine walking through a large forest in heavy fog. At first you can only see a few feet ahead. As the fog begins to lift, new paths become visible. Some trails that looked promising disappear. Others suddenly become much more important. That does not mean you were walking in the wrong direction before. It means you could only work with what you were able to see at the time. Investigations often unfold in much the same way. According to experienced investigators who have discussed major cases publicly, one of the most difficult decisions is determining what information should be released and when. Release too much too early, and it may interfere with interviews or alert someone investigators hope to question. Release too little, and people begin filling the gaps themselves. That second problem has become increasingly common in the age of social media. Within minutes of a press conference ending, thousands of viewers begin analyzing every sentence. A pause becomes meaningful. A missing word becomes a theory. An answer that sounds cautious is interpreted by some as uncertainty. Others hear confidence. The same statement can produce completely different conclusions depending on who is listening. That appears to have happened repeatedly in discussions surrounding Nancy Guthrie's case. Some viewers believed officials were signaling that one motive had become more likely. Others heard only the standard language of an active investigation. Neither side had access to the complete investigative file. Both were working from the same public information. That difference is important. There is often a gap between what investigators know and what they are willing to discuss publicly. Those are not always the same thing. For example, authorities may possess evidence they believe is reliable but not yet ready to present in court. They may be waiting for laboratory testing. They may still be interviewing witnesses. They may be comparing timelines from multiple sources. Until those steps are complete, investigators often avoid making statements that appear more definite than the evidence allows. Records from many high-profile investigations show this cautious approach is common. Public confidence can be affected by every word investigators choose. Once a statement has been made, it is difficult to walk it back. That is why officials often rely on phrases such as, "the investigation remains active," "all leads are being pursued," or, "we are not ruling anything out." Those phrases may sound repetitive. They are. But they also serve a purpose. They avoid closing doors that investigators still need to keep open. Even so, repeated caution can leave families and the public wanting more. For those who care deeply about Nancy Guthrie's case, every update carries emotional weight. People want certainty. They want someone to say that investigators finally know why everything happened. Instead, they continue hearing that work remains ongoing. That emotional gap between expectation and reality often fuels speculation. Then something unexpected happened. Attention began shifting away from individual statements and toward the broader pattern. People started placing interviews side by side. They compared press briefings from different months. They examined comments made by investigators, prosecutors, and reporters. Some believed they saw a gradual evolution. Others believed the messaging had actually remained consistent, with only different portions being highlighted at different times. Without access to internal investigative discussions, neither interpretation can be confirmed. But examining why those impressions developed tells us something valuable. Communication during major investigations is rarely designed to answer every public question. Its primary purpose is often much narrower. Authorities may be asking for specific information. They may be correcting inaccurate rumors. They may be encouraging witnesses to come forward. They may simply be confirming that work continues. Everything else is secondary. That distinction sometimes gets lost. News organizations understandably focus on what is new. If investigators repeat the same position for 3 weeks, that rarely becomes a headline. But if one sentence introduces a different emphasis, that sentence receives attention. Viewers naturally assume something significant has changed. Sometimes it has. Sometimes it has not. The challenge is knowing the difference. Another factor worth considering is that large investigations rarely involve only one person. Cases can include local police departments, state agencies, federal investigators, forensic specialists, prosecutors, and analysts. Each group may have different responsibilities. Each spokesperson may answer different questions. Even when everyone is working from the same evidence, their public comments may emphasize different aspects of the investigation. That does not necessarily indicate disagreement. It may simply reflect their particular role. An evidence specialist may discuss forensic work. A prosecutor may avoid discussing motive entirely. A public information officer may focus on witness appeals. A reporter interviewing each of them could easily produce 3 stories that sound different, even though they are describing the same investigation. That possibility is worth remembering as people review statements related to Nancy Guthrie's case. Another detail deserves attention. Throughout many investigations, motive itself often changes in importance. Early on, investigators may spend considerable time asking why someone would commit a crime. Later, once physical or digital evidence becomes stronger, motive may become less central. The focus shifts toward establishing exactly what happened and who can be connected to the evidence. That does not mean motive disappears. It simply becomes one part of a much larger picture. Legal experts frequently point out that prosecutors are not always required to prove motive beyond a reasonable doubt. They must prove the elements of the offense using admissible evidence. A motive can strengthen a narrative for a jury, but it is not always essential if other evidence is persuasive. That legal reality may also influence how investigators speak publicly. They may spend less time discussing theories about why something happened and more time concentrating on evidence that can ultimately withstand courtroom scrutiny. For viewers, however, motive remains deeply compelling. Human beings naturally search for explanations. Understanding why something happened helps us make sense of events that otherwise feel impossible to understand. That is one reason Nancy Guthrie's case continues to attract such close attention. People are not only searching for answers. They are searching for meaning. And when official explanations appear incomplete, speculation often fills the silence. Witnesses have reportedly continued coming forward with information over time, while investigators have encouraged anyone with relevant knowledge to contact authorities. As in many active investigations, officials have emphasized verifiable evidence rather than public debate, and important details remain undisclosed. That brings us to another question that may be even more important than the discussion about motive itself. If investigators have been carefully choosing what to say, and what not to say, what effect has that communication had on the people closest to the case? Because beyond the headlines, the theories, and the public analysis are families waiting for answers, investigators balancing transparency with strategy, and a community trying to understand events that remain only partially explained. Those human consequences become impossible to ignore once we look at what happened next. As the months passed, one thing became increasingly clear. The discussion surrounding Nancy Guthrie's case was no longer focused only on evidence. It had also become a conversation about communication. People were listening just as closely to what investigators said as to what they did. Every interview was examined. Every press conference was replayed. Every carefully chosen sentence was discussed by viewers, reporters, and followers of the case. That level of attention is understandable. When a case captures national interest, people naturally look for clues wherever they can find them. Sometimes those clues come from physical evidence. Sometimes they come from witness accounts. And sometimes they come from the way officials describe the investigation itself. But those are very different kinds of information. Evidence can eventually be tested in court. Public statements often cannot. That distinction is important because it reminds us that communication is not evidence. It is simply one part of an ongoing investigation. According to law enforcement professionals who have spoken publicly about major criminal cases over the years, investigators often have to balance two competing responsibilities. The first is keeping the public informed. The second is protecting the integrity of the investigation. Those goals do not always fit together perfectly. A detailed explanation might satisfy public curiosity, but it could also reveal information that investigators would rather keep confidential. On the other hand, saying very little can leave room for misunderstanding. Neither choice is perfect. That reality may explain why some of the public messaging in Nancy Guthrie's case has appeared cautious. Investigators may simply have been trying to avoid making statements that could later complicate the investigation. That does not necessarily mean they lacked confidence in their work. Nor does it automatically mean there was disagreement among agencies. Without access to internal discussions, there is no verified basis for claiming that investigators within the FBI, or among any agencies involved, were divided over the motive. What can be said is much more limited. The public emphasis changed over time. Different updates highlighted different aspects of the investigation. Observers interpreted those changes in different ways. Those facts are supported by the public record. The reasons behind those communication choices remain known only to the investigators involved. For families waiting for answers, however, those distinctions offer little comfort. Every passing week can feel longer than the last. Birthdays arrive. Holidays pass. Ordinary routines continue for everyone else while uncertainty remains. Anyone who has lived through the disappearance of a loved one has described that uncertainty as one of the hardest parts. There is no clear ending. No definite explanation. Just questions that refuse to go away. Those questions affect more than immediate family members. Friends revisit old conversations. Neighbors remember ordinary moments that suddenly seem significant. Communities begin looking at familiar places differently. People ask themselves whether they overlooked something that could have mattered. That emotional impact often lasts long after news cameras have left. Meanwhile, investigators continue working behind the scenes. Much of that work is rarely visible to the public. Case files grow thicker. Tips are evaluated. Witnesses are interviewed again. Digital evidence is reviewed with newer technology. Forensic testing may continue long after public attention has shifted elsewhere. History has shown that some investigations make important progress years after they first begin. New witnesses emerge. Advances in forensic science provide additional answers. Someone decides to speak after remaining silent for years. A seemingly insignificant detail suddenly connects two pieces of information that previously appeared unrelated. Those developments remind us why investigators are often reluctant to declare a case finished before every reasonable lead has been examined. Nancy Guthrie's case remains one that continues to generate discussion precisely because so many people hope those unanswered questions will eventually receive clear answers. Among those questions, motive remains one of the most difficult. People often assume that understanding why something happened will explain everything else. Real investigations are rarely that simple. Sometimes the motive becomes obvious only after an arrest. Sometimes it remains uncertain even after a conviction. Occasionally, investigators identify what happened with considerable confidence while still debating exactly why it happened. Human behavior does not always fit into neat categories. That is why experienced investigators usually rely on evidence first and theories second. Evidence can be measured. It can be tested. It can be challenged. Theories must always remain open to revision if new facts emerge. That approach may seem slow from the outside. Yet it is one of the reasons criminal investigations are able to withstand careful examination in court. Looking back over the public discussion surrounding Nancy Guthrie's case, one lesson stands out. It is easy to mistake changing communication for changing conclusions. Sometimes they are the same. Sometimes they are not. Without the complete investigative record, it is impossible to know where one ends and the other begins. That uncertainty can be frustrating. It can also serve as an important reminder to separate verified facts from assumptions. Throughout this story, we've looked at why some people believe the public messaging appeared mixed. We've also examined several practical reasons why investigators might communicate cautiously during an active case. Neither explanation proves what investigators were thinking internally. Instead, it shows how complex major investigations can become once public interest grows. Every statement carries weight. Every omission is noticed. Every update is compared with those that came before it. For reporters covering the case, that means asking careful questions without assuming answers that have not been confirmed. For investigators, it means protecting the case while maintaining public trust. For families, it means continuing to wait for the certainty they deserve. And for all of us watching from the outside, it means remembering the difference between what is known, what is believed, and what remains unresolved. Those three categories should never be treated as though they are the same. The Nancy Guthrie investigation continues to raise difficult questions, and until authorities release additional verified information, some of those questions will remain unanswered. That does not lessen their importance. If anything, it reminds us why careful reporting and patience matter so much in cases like this. As new information becomes public, earlier assumptions may need to be revisited. That is not a weakness in the investigative process. It is often how the search for the truth progresses. Thank you for spending this time with me as we carefully examined one of the most discussed aspects of this case. I'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you think the public statements reflected an investigation that evolved as new evidence emerged, or do you believe they simply reflected a cautious communication strategy while investigators continued their work? Share your perspective in the comments below. As always, please keep the discussion respectful and focused on verified information. If you found this analysis helpful and you'd like to follow future updates on developing investigations, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue producing thoughtful, fact-based coverage of stories that deserve careful attention. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.